Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to welcome to the show Jen Deerinwater and Ezra Starr. Well, welcome back, Jen Deerinwater, and welcome, Ezra Starr. Jen Deerinwater is a bisexual, two-spirit, multiply disabled citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and an award-winning journalist and organizer who covers the myriad of issues Jen's communities face with an intersectional lens. Jen is the founding executive director of Crushing Colonialism, which you can find at crushingcolonialism.org. Ezra Starr is a multiply disabled trans Jewish drag king based in DC, performing as the drag king Neurocosmos. They are also the producer and host of Disabled Delight, DC's first openly all-disabled drag show, passionate about centering disabled art as essential to disability justice movements. Jen and Ezra, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm happy to be back.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start, we're recording this on August 2nd for folks who are wondering where we are in space and time. And July 26th marked the 34th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I wanted to get into the legacy of that a little bit later. But first, I want to start with a project that both of you are a part of, that's Disability Divest, which folks can find out more about at disabilitydivest.org. The primary message being, we demand the disability establishment end its relationship with war profiteers. So starting off here, y'all, can you talk a little bit about what the disability establishment is and what relationships it has with war profiteers?
So I used to work in disability rights orgs for some time. So I was one of the few people in Disability Divest who was formerly or currently affiliated. A lot of them are led by disabled people, but a lot of what we mean by disability establishment is that they are disability rights organizations, a lot of them located in the DC area, that are very focused on a rights understanding of disability, of trying to make the system change from the inside, and trying to reform the system and work with people who are in groups who are embedded in that system to make change. Instead, while Disability Divest is taking a lot of influence from the disability justice movement that was created by Black and Indigenous disabled queer artists in the mid 2000s, who are saying the entire system is warped. We have to build a new system and challenge the one that currently exists. So a lot of these disability rights orgs like AAPD, Disability In, operate from the standpoint of, in order to change things for disabled people, we need to work with corporations and other weapons manufacturers, for example, to get them to be more inclusive of disabled people, instead of being like, hey, the fact that we're partnering with weapons manufacturers is awful in the first place.
Did you want to add anything, Jen?
Yeah, I think I could add just a little bit about the details of how there is this tie-in between the war systems and these orgs. Okay. Yeah, and so part of the issue is that really you can see this across the nonprofit industrial complex. Corporations and horrible entities end up having to sponsor a lot of nonprofit organizations for survival. But then these nonprofit orgs like Disability In and AAPD, they just, as Ezra was saying, they start buying into these ideas of how we're supposed to operate. And so examples of how the military industrial complex is tied to the disability rights establishment is through things like awards and sponsorships. Disability In does a list every year of some of the best places for disabled people to work, and they give awards. Well, weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin are on that list. And then there's AAPD, which Ezra and I were two people out of a small group of Disability Divest folks who disrupted AAPD's reception last week, celebrating the Americans with Disabilities Act. They, for example, were sponsored by a litany of really problematic corporations that you could hold accountable for multiple reasons, but specifically around Palestinian genocide, like Starbucks, Northrop Grumman, Wells Fargo. I can't even remember who all there were, but there were several really problematic sponsors that were there, and Wells Fargo was there speaking. So this is kind of, great examples of how Disability Divest came to be, and what we're referring to when we talk about the disability rights establishment and how they're in league with Palestinian genocide and war and, a whole host of really awful issues.
And just before we move on, I want to talk specifically about what's going on in Gaza, but I wanted to ask just real quick, what was the response when y'all disrupted this event?
Yeah, so I think for a little bit of context, AAPD has been around since the late 1990s. So they've had like programs such as their summer internship program and their HERN awards, or like where they award disabled people like to help like fund their projects. Those have been around for like a little over 20 years. So this is a very established org that's had partnerships with Google, like for example, for a long time with Google, like being on the board, and Google's part of No Tech for apartheid. And so AAPD is considered in a lot of ways to be the disabled-led disability rights org, the main one in DC, the main one like with most power. And so a lot of people are afraid to challenge that organization, and they've never been disrupted before. And I noticed that, for full disclosure, I did used to intern there, so parts of my knowledge came from both. So parts of my understanding of their corporate relationship came from from seeing them inside as well as observing them outside. But when we did this, there was a lot of support, especially from there's a lot of support in the audience, and that who are happy that we're doing it. And there also was a lot of people like very taken aback. They're yelling at us to get off the stage, and in real, there's mind your own business. There are folks who support Israel that tried to instigate, like with us. They tried to talk over like Jen when Jen was reading the disability divest demands, and hotel security called the police, and 30 MPD folks showed up to potentially arrest a small group of people, and the organization had to get the cops to leave. And that was largely because one of the attendees of who's a exec director of a different org, like said, get the cops to leave. But basically, there has been a really significant positive response online, because people are saying, wow, disability divest is like challenging Wells Fargo and AAPD in this way. This is a really powerful thing to see.
Did you want to add anything, Jen?
Yeah, so normally when I am at any sort of disruptions or direct actions and such, I'm usually there as press. I don't often take part as the disruptor or the organizer, activist, whatever you want to call them. I do every once in a while. This was one of those occasions where I felt really compelled to take part. But I'll be honest, I didn't really know what to expect. I've never done any organizing against any disability organizations before. I have taken part in protests and things against Wells Fargo. I know that they're not afraid to sick security on people and such, but this was just a very different scenario than I'd been in before. And I really, when I am doing like nonviolent direct action, I really try to just stay focused on whatever that role is, whether I'm there as press, I am reading the demands, whatever it is, I try to stay in that zone the best I can and just trust that the rest of the group will do their roles, whether that's, cop liaison, care bear there to take care of us, etc. I did hear from the crowd, mind your business. I did hear that a few times. And I just chose to keep on moving and ignore it, even though I wanted to be like, okay, we're on Piscataway land right now, and I'm not Piscataway. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, but I think I have way more right to be here speaking than you do. So you sit down and mind your business was what I wanted to say, but I didn't, It was interesting though watching it. I didn't really think that there would probably be a lot of cops. And then someone came up behind me and said, "Hey, Jen, the police are here." And I looked up and there was a swarm of MPD. And I was like, my God, where did they come from? They just descended all of a sudden. At one point, I'm assuming this man was hotel security, but someone got up on the stage while I was reading our demands, and they kind of lunged at me to take away my list of demands. And I use a disability scooter a lot of times now, and so I was just in my scooter, and I just kind of like maneuvered around him, and then I saw someone run up towards the stage and like, "No, leave her alone." And then some people jumped in front of me and between me and I guess the hotel security. It was interesting, but then there were the ASL interpreters kept going even though AAPD told them not to. And there was one person that looked like they may have just been there as an attendee who got up and was doing ASL. So even though there were some in the crowd who were clearly against us, it did still seem like there was some levels of support. When we left, I did see some people suddenly wearing keffiyehs and such. Like it was interesting, it was really interesting. And I just yeah, I'll stop there because I'm going to keep rambling. So I'll stop there.
That is interesting. Quite a mixed bag. I'm glad that you could scoot away from the security guard. We use the tools we have at our fingertips. So specifically with regards to what's going on, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, I just wanted to share with listeners some numbers, even though the numbers are really hard or impossible to quantify. Earlier this year, the International Committee of the Red Cross reported to the NGO Humanity and Inclusion that 70 to 80% of the people coming into the barely functioning and remaining hospitals in Gaza have had limbs amputated or have had spinal cord injuries. There's no way to currently count the numbers of newly disabled children and adults, but already back in January of this year, UNICEF estimated that 10 children a day in Gaza were losing a limb due to Israel's genocide. And of course, these numbers do not include all disabilities, both ones created by genocide and all others that are a part of life just made worse by it. So I was wondering if y'all could talk a little bit about this. This is a very like a less reported issue, the issue of disability in Gaza and how this connects to the other terrors mentioned in your on your website, namely things happening in Congo and Sudan.
Yeah, I think I'll make sure to I think Jen is like the most qualified to answer this one, so I'll just be brief. I think a lot of the understanding in disability justice space, and I think it's best encapsulated by an article by Leah Piepsna Samara Sinha called like Palestine is Disabled. And so the idea of like people who were born with disability are further disabled by this genocide, and genocide is is creating disability, and colonialism intentionally is creating disability in the countries that they colonize, and that is the dynamic that we that it's important, essential for more disabled people to be naming and centering when talking about Palestine, Congo, Sudan, and Tigray.
Yeah, I think we talk a bit in Disability Divest about colonialism and imperialism. And while yes, a lot of the focus is on Gaza right now, it is Sudan, it is Congo, it's Turtle Island. There's so many different types of genocide that are happening around the world, and they all tie into colonialism and capitalism in all of these different ways. And colonialism and capitalism and imperialism create disabilities, and they worsen existing disabilities. Just like at this point, I feel pretty safe in saying there isn't a single Palestinian in Gaza who does not have a disability of some kind at this point. You can look at colonized peoples around the world and see high rates of disabilities. Here in the so-called US, American Indians and Alaskan Natives have the highest rates per capita of disabilities of any other ethnic or racial group. You can see that in so-called Australia, where there's actually a group similar to Disability Divest there called Crips Contra Colonialism that's doing similar work there to what we're doing here, holding disability establishments responsible. I just, as somebody who runs a nonprofit, and I understand how hard it is to get money, I understand, I really do. But like I don't know how you can have this organization that's supposed to serve disabled people while you are in league with politicians and corporations and entities and individuals and such who are creating disabilities and worsening disabilities and killing disabled people and institutionalizing them. How could you be okay with that? And so for me, it's just all of these issues are interconnected. What's being done to one will be done to another, and so on. There is no liberation for one without liberation for all. And I have a lot of different identities. I'm queer, Native, disabled, all of this, but I feel like with the disability community, we are the most, even on a global level, the most diverse of all oppressed communities, because anyone can become a member of the disability community at any point in their lifetime. So unfortunately, we do have some conservative and right-wing and fascist folks and whatnot in our communities, but they're not really a part of community. They're not there for disabled people. They're not there for disabled justice. They're for their own. They're there for their own grab at power.
Yeah, and I want to dig a little deeper into that because that connection, because I think that some people might feel like, oh, well, just, solidarity is just a good thing to have with people across the globe, but it's far more visceral and visceral than that. I would argue that it's impossible to dehumanize disabled people in Gaza or in Sudan or in Congo unless you already have a working paradigm of doing so at home. So this paradigm of dehumanizing disabled people starts here and then is, militarily or economically or what have you, exported to these other places. And of course, Israel being a US colony is part of that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that overarching paradigm of the dehumanization of disabled people.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. I say it's the dehumanization of the entire population, and a lot of the the Zionist entity uses in language discussion. They describe Palestinians with animalistic language, with anti-Arab language, and all that language is also directed at Black, Indigenous, Latina, and Asian people here. So it really shows to me how inseparable ableism and racism are from each other, and that the liberation of disabled people requires the liberation of all people of color, both disabled and not. And like as we said, like a lot of this, Jen very much rooted the actions connections to home, because we knew, like I first starting out before Jen knew, that Wells Fargo had taken given a millions of dollar loan to Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli weapons manufacturer. And so Jen was the one to come to us with the knowledge of, because Jen's been protesting Wells Fargo for years, that Wells Fargo was one of the biggest funders of Dakota Access Pipeline and ICE detention centers and in private prisons. So it was really important to us, like, even though most of Disability Divest work has been on Palestine right now, that with this protest, we root those connections in how Wells Fargo is perpetuating harm domestically, like in order for disabled people to see like how those things are interconnected with each other. I was kind of almost laughable to me, because when we stormed the stage, there was an automated announcer saying, "We at the AAPD welcome all opinions and views on many topical matters." At the same time, while saying that and panicking. What I should have mentioned a bit earlier. So the contractor they hired to do the virtual live stream of the event decided to cut the live stream audio, captions, and ASL for the entire time we protested. AAPD says they were not aware until after that this happened, but it's that dynamic of like having an automated voice, also the dynamic of having a voice tell you, please stop speaking, please stop, and well, also we're gonna cut your audio because we don't want people to know that we're all like capable of challenging an establishment.
We even, because we had somebody screen record AAPD's live stream, we actually have them on recording. You can hear somebody in the background saying, you know, cut the audio, cut the ASL. Like you can hear someone saying that. Yes. So, but the dehumanization part, the dehumanization of disabled people, that's such a big question that you asked, that I'm like, oh man, my brain is just spiraling out, and I'm not quite sure where to focus in. But you know, I feel like you can't just dehumanize disabled people if you're not also dehumanizing other groups of people. Because if you're willing to disable certain groups, then you've already dehumanized them, you know. There's very limited statistics out there, but on the research that has been done, it's found that about half of all people who are killed by the police in the so-called US have a disability. Vast majorities of incarcerated people have some form of disability. You know, there's so many ties. You know, the the police forces in the so-called US, they go to Israel and they train with Israel. There's ties between Cop City and Atlanta and Israel. You know, like, to me, you can't say you care about disabled people while you're supporting these other projects, you know. Disabled people are disproportionately houseless in this country. Thanks to this recent Supreme Court case, now houseless people can be incarcerated. We already had houseless people being put in mental institutions in New York City under Mayor Adams. You know, just the levels of degradation and dehumanization continue on. Reproductive justice issues. It's legal on a federal level to sterilize disabled people against our will. Well, if you cared about disabled people, then maybe you would have cared about codifying Roe v. Wade into law. You know, to me, it's just like, if we didn't degrade disabled people, then all of these other issues wouldn't be where they are. But I also want to add, Amani Barbarin is this amazing Black disabled content creator, speaker. A video that she did, I don't even know when, but she talked about how if they, meaning the powers that be, want you disabled, they will make you disabled. And she specifically talked about the runaway slave syndrome and the idea that when enslaved African people ran away, they were considered mentally ill for running away. And that instantly, to me, made me think about the, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name, but it was in quote, insane asylum for Native people in South Dakota. And part of the reason they would lock up natives there is we're saying like, oh, you don't want to give us your land, you must be mentally ill. So, you know, the degradation of disabled people is really the degradation of all people. You know, if we actually cared about humanity, if we actually saw the humanity in everyone, then we wouldn't degrade disabled people either.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of that context. And while you were speaking, I'm also reminded of, you know, the long history of putting women into insane asylums because they, you know, refused to marry some guy, or they refused to get raped by their husband, or because they were you know, they were well aware and adamant that they should have certain rights. Yeah. So those connections are very, very clear, and I think it's important to do what y'all have done and connect all those so that people see that, like, this isn't about whether you're disabled or whether you're not, but about these connections that we all have and that we exist on an oppression spectrum. I think that's really important. And finally, because we are very close to that 34th anniversary. It was just a few days ago. I'm curious how y'all feel about the Americans with Disabilities Act. What do you feel that it accomplished? And how do you feel about the present day moving in tomorrow, particularly when we have these kind of organizations that y'all just protested kind of at the helm?
Yeah, that was very much actually at the heart of why Disability Divest formed, because like one of my co-founders like came to me and said, Disability Pride Month is coming up in July, and the 34th anniversary is coming up. I'm really struggling, at least said to me, I'm really struggling with how do how to engage with this while multiple genocides are happening as disability establishment is silent in being actively complicit in these ways. When the Disability Equality Index rating Lockheed Martin as 100 for best places to work for disabled people, and 10 other multiple other like weapons manufacturers, like what, like, and feeling the need to do something. And I said then, like, similar to how like queer and trans like nonprofits like have like engaged in pink washing, why don't we look into this to what extent this dynamic shows up in disability rights organizations? When we found the patterns that we were seeing, we're both like, on a conscious level as a human being, we have to dive in. We have to dive into this. We have to engage and direct our attention towards bringing attention to this, to doing education or an action around this. I think in terms of the ADA, like specifically, that the event we protested was a celebration of the 34th anniversary of the ADA and marking it with having Wells Fargo, like one of your presenting sponsors, speaking. Just it was just deeply, really messed up. I think I'm someone who grew up like after the ADA was passed. And I think as I worked more in interned more in disability rights, like space that were more focused on reforming the system rather than challenging the system like entirely, I saw like more the lateral ableism and queer phobia I experienced in those spaces, and the racism and xenophobia like I observed like internally in those spaces, largely because like those disability rights or like establishment were so focused on a single issue rather than expanding out to really include all disabled people impacted by multiple systems of oppression. The ADA was created under a Republican government. It was created like in the era of like bipartisanship. So the way like it's structured entirely plays into that reform law. It was designed politically to meet like Democrats' demands and Republicans' demands. Disabled people were working with both sides of the aisle in order to make that happen. We're now in an era where Republicans and a lot of disabled community are in very completely different places. Bipartisanship is not being is not like central to disability like advocacy like anymore really. It's not something that works at this time. And so the ADA like is an archive that law. Like, yeah, you can go into like multiple establishments are required to be wheelchair accessible, but religious churches, synagogues aren't required to. It's engaging with those compromises. So it's like I both benefited from it as a disabled person born after it, and I saw the multiple systems oppressions that were still embedded within the creation of the law and still continue after it.
Yeah, the ADA, I'd rather it exist than not exist, but it's more often than not, I don't think a very particularly helpful piece of legislation for the average disabled person. I mean, first of all, it was really only made to benefit wheelchair users. There are all kinds of disabilities out there that require a wide variety of disability needs. You know, I was born before the ADA. I definitely remember what it was like in school. I was not considered disabled as a child, but I definitely remember seeing the disabled kids at my school being sequestered off in their classroom and on their bus. And so I don't know, the ADA, I have so many frustrating experiences with it because there's also no enforcement body for it. The only way a disabled person can maybe have the ADA apply to their life more often than not is to file a lawsuit. The CVS that's brand new, only 2 years old down the street from me, their door opening button never works. That's a pharmacy. The amount of medical institutions and facilities I go to that are not disability accessible is astounding. I have a HUD complaint right now against the DC Housing Authority for breaking the ADA and like violating it in numerous occasions. So even with its existence, it's still not doing that much for disabled people, in my opinion. There was even a case that thankfully the Supreme Court dismissed it as moot, but the Atkinson Hotels versus Laufer case, where there was actually an attempt to strip away the power of disabled people to file lawsuits against businesses that did not provide disability services under the ADA. So it's just this legislation where I'm like, it kind of exists in name only, and even in name, it's not that great. I mean, the way I get treated, even in federal government buildings, is absurd. I was invited several years back to an event at the US Capitol, and I came in with my cane, and the security guard was instantly like, "Do you need that?" Just on me. And I looked at him, I was like, "Yes, you can't put it through the conveyor belt." And at that point, I was just like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. You can wand me. And I said, well, I'm disabled and need this. And I'm here as a guest for a disability event, no less. Ugh. They just seem so perturbed to have to wand me, as opposed to me just throwing my cane on the conveyor belt and walking through the security apparatus thing. That's the government. So I don't know. I've rambled a bit, as I tend to do, but the ADA, eh.
I mean, it sounds like a lot of things that the government does. Like you fell backwards into something that was kind of good, but not really. Yeah, absolutely. And also it's just so like, why would you bring a cane if you didn't need it? Like, what am I going to do? Putting on the Ritz? Like, I'm not here to do, like, that's so bizarre.
Exactly. Like, do you think that disabled people are treated so well that able-bodied people are out here imitating us and buying and putting money into mobility equipment to pretend to be disabled? Are you kidding me? Of course I need the damn cane. Shoot, I'm sorry, I forgot I cursed.
That's fine. Oh, that's so bizarre. Well, anyway, Jen and Ezra, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us. If folks want to learn more about Disability Divest, including reading the demands that Jen, in case you weren't there to hear them when Jen read them out, you can visit disabilitydivest.org. Are there any other sites or places that you'd like people to know about before we sign off?
Yeah, I think we do have our own Instagram, and that is at Disability Divest, and where you can see all of our posts, and in our bio, like, we have a link tree that includes a demand letter where you can sign on to the demands letter as an individual, and in where a group can reach out to us to say if they want to endorse as a group. And I think most importantly, we also include our link tree links to fundraisers for disabled people and Palestinian families with disabled members who are raising money to evacuate Gaza, and we want to encourage people to donate to those. We also include a link to Crips for eSIMs for Gaza, which is an initiative started by Leah Piepzna Samara Sinha and Alice Wan to donate eSIMs to Palestinians in Gaza. And we also have Twitter, that's Disability Divest, because for some reason we couldn't do Disability Divest on X. So you have Twitter and TikTok as well. I would say like our Instagram at Disability Divest, and our website, disabilitydivest.org, is our is our main places to be. We have an actions tab that includes both our letter to AAPD and our letter to Disability In. And our letter is available has an ASL version and a plain language version for people with developmental disabilities.
Anything to add, Jen, before we wrap up? All right. Well, thank y'all so much for taking the time to sit down with us. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having us here.
Of course. Thank you for having me and Jen on the show.